Something terrifying lives in the Ozark Mountains. You've been warned. The knocking started on the third night. 3 hollow beats from the dark tree line, deliberate as a man rapping on a courthouse door, and by the 9th night, it was coming from directly outside the canvas wall of my tent, 18 inches from my head. That is not the strangest thing I have to tell you. The strangest thing is what we found driven into the ground that 5th morning, and what it told us about how long something had been standing at the edge of our camp while we slept without knowing it. My name is Gerald Purvis Alcott. I am 41 years old. I have been a licensed land surveyor since 1908, and I am speaking to you today in October of 1932 at the request of Mr. Dale Carver, who identified himself as a folklore researcher working under the Federal Writers Program out of Fayetteville. I agreed to this interview because Mr. Carver told me that 2 of my former crew members had already spoken to him and that their accounts were, in his words, remarkably consistent with one another. That consistency matters to me. I have spent 9 years being told by people who were not there that what we experienced in that hollow was a combination of bad weather, overwrought nerves, and the particular way sound travels between sandstone ridges after dark. I have sat in offices and said nothing while men with engineering degrees and railroad contracts explained to me what I heard and what I saw and what the bent survey rod was evidence of. So I am glad to speak plainly now, on record, and I will ask Mr. Carver to note that I am not a man given to exaggeration. I spent 15 years measuring the world in tenths of feet. Precision is my profession, not a character trait I am borrowing for the occasion. I will tell you what happened in the order it happened, and I will tell you when I am less certain and when I am absolutely certain, and at the end I am going to say something directly into that recording apparatus that I want written down in full, because it is the reason I agreed to speak at all. The job came to us in late February of 1923 through a civil engineering firm out of Springfield, Missouri, which held the preliminary survey contract for the Missouri Pacific Railroad. The railroad was evaluating a proposed corridor through the Boston Mountains in the northwestern corner of Arkansas, specifically a route that would cut through a series of deep, forested hollows southeast of the town of Mountainburg. The idea was to find a grade shallow enough to make a spur line economically viable, without the expense of excessive grading and fill. That is why you needed surveyors before you needed engineers. We were the men who told the engineers whether the land would cooperate. I had worked for the Springfield firm before, on a township plat in Howell County 2 years earlier, and the principal there, a man named Emmett Forsyth, telephoned me in mid-February and offered me the lead position on the crew. The pay was good, the timeline was 12 weeks in the field with a penalty clause if we ran long, and it was spring work in hill country, which is the best kind of surveying there is. I said yes within 24 hours. I want to tell you about the 3 men I brought with me, because who they were matters to understanding what happened to each of them, and because I owe it to at least one of them to say his name out loud in an official record somewhere. The first was my instrument man, Raymond Stell. Ray was 52 in the spring of 1923 and had been working surveys and construction layouts since before I had my own license. He had also served 2 years with the Army Corps of Engineers during the war, which is where he developed his ear for sound in the field. Ray was the one who first identified what we were hearing as something genuinely outside his experience, and that identification carried weight with me precisely because Ray did not alarm easily. He had a habit of humming to himself while he worked the transit, old hymns mostly, just under his breath, and the fact that he stopped humming by the 4th day was the first indication I had that he was taking the situation seriously. Ray was a compact, careful man, with thick hands and a habit of writing everything in a small, hard-edged script that I always had to hold at arm's length to read. He made it out of that hollow. He is one of the 2 men whose account Mr. Carver showed me before this interview, and I can tell you without reservation that reading Ray Stell's account of those events, 9 years later in a different state, was one of the stranger experiences of my adult life. The second man was Thomas Greer, who went by Greer or sometimes by Tom, depending on who was talking to him. Greer was 34, from Joplin, and had been my rodman on 3 previous jobs. He was physically strong, which matters in that terrain, and he was the kind of man who did not speak unless he had something to say, which meant that when he did speak, you listened. Greer had a practical, skeptical turn of mind that I had always valued on a crew, because a rodman who questions whether the instrument is leveled is more useful than one who assumes it is. That same skepticism, as I will explain, became a source of real friction in the final days. Greer made it out. His account was the third one Mr. Carver showed me, and it is Greer who independently used the word I used, and that Ray Stell used, without any of us having spoken about it in the intervening years. The third man was a junior rodman named Calvin Marsh. He was 23 years old, had been working field surveys for about 18 months, and came to me recommended by a professor at the University of Arkansas at Fayetteville who had overseen his technical coursework. Calvin was the youngest man on the crew and the most talkative, which is not a criticism. He had an enthusiasm for the work that I recognized from my own early years, the particular pleasure a young man gets from spending his days outdoors with a purpose and a set of instruments and a result at the end of each day he can point to. He was not a weak person. I want to be clear about that, because I think the easiest reading of what happened to Calvin Marsh is that his youth, or his nerves, got the better of him, and I do not believe that is an accurate reading. I believe Calvin understood something in the last hours that the rest of us were not willing to understand until we had no choice, and I believe his decision, whatever it was made with full awareness. His body was never recovered. The survey contract was never completed, and I have thought about Calvin Marsh every morning since May of 1923, which is when we came out of that hollow without him. I will come back to the last night. I need to build toward it in the right order, or it will not make sense. We drove south from Springfield on March 28, 1923, with 2 vehicles, a Ford Model T truck carrying the equipment and a Dodge touring car for the crew. The equipment included a Gurley Transit, 2 survey rods, a chain and pins, a hand level, an aneroid barometer, and all the associated field books and recording materials. We had tents, a camp stove, provisions for 12 weeks, and a coal oil lantern for each man. The firm had arranged for us to replenish provisions at a general store in Mountainburg every 2 to 3 weeks, and Forsyth had given me the name of a local man, a farmer named Dillard Cates, who had agreed to let us park the vehicles on his property at the edge of the hollow for the duration of the work. We arrived at the Cates farm on the evening of March 29th, a Friday, and Dillard Cates was waiting for us on his porch when we pulled in. He was a man somewhere in his mid-60s, lean, with the particular weathered economy of movement that hill farmers develop over a lifetime of doing everything themselves. He helped us unload without being asked, which I appreciated, and he showed us the track that would take us down into the hollow the next morning. He was not unfriendly, but there was something in the way he watched us unpack the transit case that I noticed and did not take seriously enough. He looked at that transit the way a man looks at someone else's child doing something dangerous near a drop-off. Not panicked, just watchful. After we had eaten and the crew had turned in, Kate sat with me on the porch of his farmhouse and drank coffee and talked about the terrain. He told me the track into the hollow was passable for about a mile before it became too rough for a vehicle, and that the watershed below that point was thick with second-growth timber over old ridgeland that had been logged once, around 1890, and then left completely alone. He said the hollow ran roughly 7 miles between the ridges before it opened back out, and that the creek at its floor ran clear, except after heavy rain. Useful things, surveyor things. And then, when the coffee was done and I was about to stand, he said something that I have turned over many times since. He said the hollow had a reputation among the families who had farmed those ridges for as long as there had been families there, and that the reputation was simple. You could pass through, and you could hunt through, but you did not make camp, and you did not stay. He did not explain it in terms of any specific creature or story. He said it the way you say a fact about weather or soil, flatly, without drama, as information he expected me to consider. He said the Osage had not camped in the deep hollows either, from what the oldest people in the county had been told by their grandparents, and that this was not a recent belief, but an old one, older than anyone could trace it back to. I thanked him for the information. I wrote it down in my field book under general notes, which I realize now is both the right and wrong thing to do with a warning. The right thing because it meant I recorded it, and the wrong thing because putting it under general notes means you have categorized it as background rather than instruction. We began the survey the following Monday, April 1st. The first 2 days were exactly what I expected. The terrain was steep-sided and heavily wooded, the kind of Ozark hill country that is genuinely beautiful in early spring, when the redbuds are still showing and the dogwood is just coming on, and hard going underfoot because the leaf mat over the clay slopes is slick and deep and hides the roots underneath it. We set up our base camp at a wide flat bench on the east side of the creek, approximately 1.25 miles in from the trailhead. The ground there was level enough for the tents and dry enough after the previous week's weather, and there was a good spring coming out of the limestone about 30 yards uphill that gave us clean water without having to treat the creek. Raymond Stell had the transit running by 8 in the morning on April 2nd, and by the end of that first day, we had established our baseline and shot our first 3 stations up the west-facing slope. The numbers were good. The grade through the upper part of the hollow was gentler than the topographic maps from the General Land Office had suggested, which was good news for the railroad's engineers, and I sent Forsyth a brief telegram from Mountainburg when Greer drove out for supplies on Wednesday, telling him the early indicators were favorable. Forsyth telegraphed back that the railroad's schedule was firm and that our 12 weeks needed to produce a complete set of profile data. I understood the pressure. I had read the penalty clause. The first 3 nights in camp were quiet in the normal sense. Creek sound, wind in the upper timber, a screech owl working the ridge above us each night around midnight. Normal night sounds for that kind of country. I slept well, which I note now because sleeping well in that camp was not a condition that lasted. It was on the night of April 4th, a Thursday, that it began. I had been asleep for what I judged to be 3 or 4 hours, when something in the quality of the dark woke me. Not a sound, exactly, not at first. More an absence. The screech owl had stopped. The creek still ran, but everything above that, the small movements and settle of a forested hillside, had gone flat and quiet in a way that does not happen in occupied country without a reason. I lay in my bedroll for perhaps 2 minutes, listening, feeling the particular alertness you develop after years of sleeping in the field, where your nervous system learns to distinguish between the quiet of deep night and the quiet of something that has silenced the night. Then it came. 3 knocks, not close. I placed them at the tree line above the western slope, 150 yards, perhaps 200, hard to gauge in the dark because the ridge bent the sound slightly, but the character of them was immediately distinct from anything I had heard in 15 years of field camping. They were hollow, not like a branch falling, which has a variable, chaotic quality, and not like the drumming behavior of a woodpecker, which is rapid and irregular. These were deliberate, evenly spaced, separated by perhaps 2 full seconds each. 3 beats, and then nothing. I counted in the dark. 3. Then silence. I lay still and counted to 60. Nothing. Counted to 60 again. Nothing. I was beginning to argue myself toward a natural explanation, which is the instinct of a man trained to explain what he measures, when they came again. 3 beats, same spacing, same hollow, resonant quality, like someone striking a long-dead hardwood trunk with a length of green sapling. Then silence. I got up and went to the tent opening and looked out. The camp was still. The lantern on the cook table had burned down to its last oil and was guttering, throwing almost no light. The tree line above us was black against a sky that had enough starlight to show me the shapes of the upper ridge, and I stood in the tent opening for 10 minutes and heard nothing more. Raymond Stell was awake. I knew it from the quality of his silence inside the tent before I even spoke. I said quietly that I had heard knocking from the ridge. He said he had heard it too. He said he had been listening since the first set, and had counted 2 series after that, while I had gotten up and gone to the opening, which meant the sounds had continued after I stopped hearing them. He said he thought it was most likely a wood-gathering behavior by a large bird working a dead snag, and that the acoustic properties of the hollow were probably amplifying it. He said this carefully, the way a man says something he is not quite sure he believes. I told him I thought the same thing, and went back to sleep, or tried to. I did not sleep again that night, and I need you to understand that this was not fear, not at that point. It was the specific alertness of a man trying to locate a sound he cannot resolve, a surveyor's instinct. I kept expecting to hear something that would pin it, give it shape, classify it. I heard nothing more until the sky went gray. Over breakfast the next morning, I mentioned the sounds to Greer and Calvin in a factual way, and asked if either of them had heard anything in the night. Greer said he had heard the first set and then slept through the rest, which I found notable. Calvin said he had been awake for all of it and had counted 4 series, which meant the sounds had continued well past the 2 sets Ray had caught. Calvin was the one who said, without any apparent discomfort, that it sounded like someone knocking on the outside of a large wooden door from a long way off. I thought that was an exact description, and I wrote it in the field book under general notes without deciding what to do with it. We worked all that day without incident. The transit ran clean. The sight lines up the west slope were good, and we pushed the traverse another quarter-mile up the hollow by late afternoon. Greer and Calvin carried the rod in rotation, one moving it ahead, while the other signaled the instrument position, and Ray kept the backsight and the record with his usual precision. I shot the instrument angles and dictated the distances. It was a good day's work. 6 weeks of that kind of work would have given the railroad what it needed, and the numbers we were building toward would have been worth every cent of the contract fee. That evening, after the meal was done, Ray sat by the cook table and said without preamble that he had been thinking about the sounds, and that he wanted to say something about them before he decided it was worth saying anything to Forsyth. I told him to go ahead. He said that in his time with the Army engineers he had worked field positions in 3 different countries, and that the one behavioral signature he had been trained to distinguish was the difference between sound that occurred and sound that was produced. His term, occurred versus produced. He said occurring sounds have a randomness in their intervals, a variation in their duration and character, even when they seem repetitive. Produced sounds have intent behind their regularity. He said the knocking from the previous night had the regularity of produced sound, and that it had been moving, not dramatically, not across a large distance, but across the night, from one position to another in a way that did not match a single stationary source. I asked him how confident he was. He said he was not certain, because gauging sound position in a curved hollow at night was not a precise science, and that he was raising it as an observation, not a conclusion. I told him it was a useful observation and that we would continue to note it. I was not going to stop the survey on the basis of a sound that might have a dozen natural explanations. I had a penalty clause and 6 weeks of work to protect. I wrote Ray's observation in the field book. I dated it. I did not send it to Forsyth. The second night brought the same thing. 3 beats. Silence. 3 beats. Then a longer silence. Then 3 more. Ray counted 6 series in total, all from the western slope, and his judgment was that the source had moved, over the course of the night, from approximately 170 yards to approximately 120 yards from the edge of camp. Not close, but not retreating. Calvin heard all 6 series. Greer heard the first 2 and said nothing more about them. I heard 5 of the 6. The morning of April 6th, the 4th day in the hollow. I want to tell you about the survey rod now, because this is the thing that most people focus on when I give this account, and I understand why. But I also want to be clear about what it meant in context, because its meaning was not just physical. Its meaning was in the timing. We were using 2 standard Gurley surveying rods, the type that telescopes to approximately 13 feet when extended and folds to a manageable length for carrying through timber. They are made of white ash and precision graded with a face of painted graduations in feet and hundredths of feet. They are not delicate instruments. But they are not tools for rough handling either. On any survey job, the rods are treated as carefully as the transit, because a damaged rod is a source of error that can cascade through a week of fieldwork before you catch it. On the morning of April 6th, Greer went to collect the rod that had been leaned against the gear pile at the edge of camp and discovered that it was not there. He said so, and we all looked, and then we found it. It was driven into the ground at the southwest corner of the camp, approximately 40 feet from the gear pile and approximately 15 feet from where the brush began at the edge of the bench. Driven vertically into the packed clay to a depth of roughly 18 inches, which I measured carefully when I pulled it. Driven hard enough that I needed both hands and considerable effort to work it free, and the clay around the base of it held the shape of the rod's section cleanly, the way clay holds a form when something is pressed into it deliberately and slowly rather than struck. And it had been bent. At the point where it emerged from the ground at the 18-inch mark, it had been bent at what I can only describe as close to a right angle. Not broken, not splintered. Bent, the way you might bend a heavy wire with your hands, except that a surveying rod is hardwood with a metal ferrule and a precision-milled face, and no human grip I have encountered could have bent one that way without a vise or a brace of some kind. I checked it carefully. There was no mark on it consistent with a mechanical tool, no compression pattern from a clamp, no abrasion from a bar. Just the bend, clean and even, at the 18-inch mark. I set it on the cook table, and the four of us looked at it for what felt like a long time. Greer was the first to speak. He said someone had come into camp in the night, and done it as a prank, possibly someone from one of the farms up on the ridge who had heard we were there and had wanted to give us a start. I asked him how that person had bent the rod without a tool. He said he did not know, but that there had to be a way he was not thinking of. Ray said nothing. Calvin said, very quietly, that no one had come into camp, because he had been awake for most of the night again, and had not heard any footsteps, and had heard the knocking instead, and that the knocking on the 5th series of the night had been to the southwest. I looked at the southwest corner of the camp. I looked at where the rod was standing. Then I put the rod in the equipment case and told the crew we were going to work. We worked. What else were you going to do? We were 6 days in. We had good data, we had a deadline, and we had a bent rod that nobody could explain, and a noise that might have been anything. I told myself these things all morning, while I looked through the transit eyepiece and called angles and watched Ray write the numbers in his small, hard-edged script. I need to tell you that the thing I planted in the ground on those early days, the thing I was growing without fully knowing it, was certainty. Not fear, not yet, certainty. Each observation was adding to a structure I was building in the back of my mind, and I kept looking at it sideways rather than directly, the way you look at a faint star that disappears when you look straight at it. If I had looked at it directly on April 6th, I would have started breaking camp. Instead, I shot instrument angles and wrote in the field book, and did not look directly at what I was building. I kept the bent rod. I want to note that for Mr. Carver's record. I kept it because it was the most tangible physical fact I had, and because surveyors keep evidence. I will come back to where it is now. The 5th night, April 7th. The knocking came earlier, before midnight, by my watch, which meant by roughly an hour and a half over the previous nights. It came from the southwest again, the same direction as the previous night's late series, and Ray's estimate when we compared notes the next morning was that the source was now between 70 and 90 yards from the edge of camp. Not at the tree line anymore, well inside the timber. 5 series through the night. I slept for perhaps 2 hours in total. Ray was awake for most of it. Greer, for the first time, said in the morning that he had been awake for the last 2 series, and had not been able to get back to sleep. He said the sound was starting to get on his nerves, which was as close as Thomas Greer came to expressing discomfort. Calvin did not say much at breakfast. He sat with his coffee and looked at the southwest corner of the camp, at the mark in the clay where the rod had been, and I watched him looking at it and said nothing. This is the point in the story where I have to tell you about something that happened between Greer and Ray, because it mattered to what came later. That afternoon, while I was shooting a long sightline up the hollow, Greer and Ray were together at a station, about 60 yards ahead of me, moving the rod for the next setup. I could see them clearly. I could not hear what they were saying, but their postures told me they were arguing, and when I walked up to the station they stopped talking and looked at their respective tasks in the studied way men adopt when they do not want to continue a conversation in front of a third party. I asked what the trouble was. Greer said there was no trouble. Ray said that he had suggested to Greer that they might consider raising the situation with me formally, meaning as a request to reconsider the camp location, and that Greer had disagreed. Greer said that moving camp or abandoning the job over a noise and a bent piece of equipment was not something he was prepared to recommend, and that he was not going to sign his name to any kind of formal complaint about it. I asked Ray if he thought we needed to move. Ray said he thought we needed to talk about it that night as a crew. I said we would. We did. That night, after supper, I laid out what I knew in the same plain terms I am using now. I said we had heard a sound we could not identify on 5 consecutive nights, that it had been approaching the camp at a rate of approximately 20 to 30 yards per night, from an estimated starting distance of 170 yards, and that at the current rate it would be at the edge of camp in 3 to 4 nights. I said we had a physical object that had been moved and altered without explanation. I said I thought these facts warranted a deliberate discussion. I asked each man to say what he thought we should do. Ray said he thought we should move camp to the upper end of the hollow, closer to the ridge saddle, and then reassess. Greer said he thought we should stay and finish the work and stop treating unidentified sounds as a reason to abandon a job with a penalty clause. He said, and I am going to quote him directly because I have never forgotten the exact words, "I am not going to be run off a survey by something that won't show itself." Calvin said he thought something was watching us, and that it had been watching us longer than we knew, and that the bent rod was a message rather than a prank, and that he thought we should think carefully about what kind of message it was. He said this without any particular drama, in the same tone you would use to read a grade elevation from a rod, and the flatness of it was more unsettling to me than if he had been frightened. I asked him what he thought the message meant. He said he thought it meant we were being shown what it could do to our things, so that we would understand what it could do to us, and that it was doing this gradually on purpose. Nobody spoke for a moment after Calvin said that. I told them we would stay through the following week, complete our work on the west slope traverse, and then make a final decision about the east slope based on how the situation developed. Greer nodded immediately. Ray looked at the lantern and said nothing, which was as close as he came to registering disagreement. Calvin said he would stay as long as we stayed. I wrote the outcome of the discussion in the field book. I noted each man's position, and I noted my own, which was that I was choosing to continue the survey while acknowledging the situation was unusual and would be monitored. I chose the careful word, unusual. It was the last professional dishonesty I committed on that job. The 6th night, April 8th. This is the night I need to tell you about carefully, because it is the night I stopped being skeptical, not because I saw anything, but because I heard something that I cannot explain in any framework I have access to. The knocking came at its usual time, just past midnight, from the southwest, and now, by Ray's reckoning and my own concurrent estimate, from approximately 50 to 60 yards beyond the edge of the bench. Inside the timber proper, which was second-growth white oak and hickory, over a dense understory of cedar and sumac, dark as pitch at night, the kind of woodland that swallows lantern light within 20 feet. 3 beats. Silence. 3 beats. Silence. And then, after the 4th series, a different sound. It is difficult to describe. Ray described it in his account, Mr. Carver tells me, as a low exhalation. And I agree with that word, except that exhalation implies it was brief, and it was not brief. It was sustained. A low, resonant output of air, below the pitch of a human voice, below the pitch of most animals I have heard in the field, below the range I associate with deer, or even the larger bear sounds, which I had heard on surveys in the Washitas. It lasted perhaps 8 to 10 seconds, and then stopped. It came from the same direction as the knocking, but from a lower point, as if whatever made it was larger than I had assumed, or closer to the ground. It did not repeat, but it did not need to. I lay in my bedroll with my eyes open and felt my understanding of the situation reorganize itself. Here is what I mean when I say I stopped being skeptical. Skepticism is not the absence of belief. It is a method of testing claims. A skeptic looks at the evidence and asks what the evidence is consistent with. I had been applying that method, and the method had been giving me room to stay. Unidentified sounds in a hollow with complex acoustics, a bent rod with no confirmed cause. These were consistent with natural phenomena I had not yet identified, and a professional man with a penalty clause and a crew to manage can find natural phenomena in a great deal of evidence if he looks for them hard enough. But there is a point at which the evidence stops being consistent with the range of natural phenomena you have access to, and starts being consistent only with something you do not have a name for. That point arrived for me on the 6th night, at approximately midnight, when I heard that sound. Not because the sound itself was impossible, but because of what it told me about the thing that made it, and because the thing it told me was that the source of the knocking was large and deliberate and breathing. I got up. Ray was sitting up in his bedroll already. We looked at each other in the dark and said nothing, which was as complete a conversation as any I have had. I went to the tent opening and listened for 20 minutes, nothing more. I went back to my bedroll. Ray lay down. Neither of us slept. In the morning, before Calvin and Greer were fully awake, I asked Ray what he thought. He said he thought we were being assessed. I asked him what he meant. He said that in his time in the field, whether it was survey work or army positions, there was a specific quality to the silence around a position when something living was trying to understand it, deciding what to do with it, and that the silence around camp on the 6th night had that quality. He said he thought the sounds were not just occurring but were a structured behavior, and that the most important thing he had noticed was that they were escalating in a way that suggested progress toward a goal rather than random territorial behavior. I asked him if he wanted to pull out. He was quiet for a long time, and then he said that it was my crew and my call, but that whatever the thing was, it was getting comfortable with us being there, and comfortable was probably not a condition we should encourage. I told him I understood, and that I was going to talk to Forsyth when Greer next made the supply run to Mountainburg, which was scheduled for April 11th. I had 3 days, by my count, 3 days to get enough additional fieldwork done to make the abandonment of the contract less catastrophic, or to convince Forsyth to extend the timeline, or to figure out what we were actually dealing with. In retrospect, 3 more days in that hollow was precisely 3 days too many. I knew enough to know I should leave. I stayed because of the contract. That is a true statement, and I am not proud of it. The 7th day, April 9th, we worked the East Slope Traverse through the morning, pushing hard, and by early afternoon we had logged a substantial piece of the upper hollow. Calvin was rod-manning well and moving efficiently through the timber, and I found myself watching him with a kind of professional admiration. He had good instincts in rough terrain, the ability to find a clear line of sight in dense cover that some men take years to develop. He was worth 3 times what I was paying him, and I told him so that afternoon while we waited for Ray to set up the next instrument position, and he thanked me and said he liked the work, and then was quiet for a moment, and then said he had not slept since the 4th night. He said it without accusation. Just as a fact, he said he had been lying awake listening to the knocking and counting the intervals, and that he had been watching where it came from each time, and that his estimate of the movement was that it was not moving in a straight line toward camp. It was moving in an arc. He said if you plotted the positions over 7 nights, the source was describing a slow curve around the southern and western sides of the camp, as if it was mapping the boundary of our position from the outside, as if it was learning the shape of where we were. I made him say that again. He said it again, in the same flat tone, and then picked up the rod for the next shot. That evening, I plotted what I knew about the sound positions on a sheet of field paper. Calvin was right. The positions Ray and I had independently estimated, mapped against the camp layout, described an arc, a slow, deliberate arc that was both approaching and encircling. It was, I realized, exactly what I would do if I wanted to understand a fixed position I had found in terrain I knew well and they did not. I stared at that paper for a long time. Then I folded it and put it in the field book. I am going to tell you now about something I noted in those days that I have never mentioned in any previous account. Because most people who ask me about this story want to talk about the rod and the knocking and the final night, and they are not wrong to want those things. But the thing that unsettled me most deeply, in the middle portion of our time in that hollow, was the birds. On the first 3 days in camp, the hollow had been full of birdsong in the way that April woodlands in the Ozarks always are. The wood thrushes and the warblers moving through the canopy, the blue jays calling across the ridge. Normal spring bird behavior in normal spring timber. From the 5th day onward, there was almost none. Not the complete absence that comes with a hawk overhead, which is brief and restores quickly, but a withdrawal, as if the birds were conducting themselves elsewhere on the landscape, as if they had concluded that the part of the hollow we occupied was not a place they would be this spring. Greer noticed it on the 6th day, and said it was probably because we were moving through the timber during the day and disturbing the habitat. I thought about that. We were not moving through the understory in any way that would have displaced birds from a large area, and birds in habituated environments will tolerate human presence once they have identified it as non-threatening. They were not tolerating our presence. They were absent from it, and they were not absent from the upper ridge. I could hear them up there, clear and normal, on those mornings when the wind was right. They were just not in the hollow. I wrote this in the field book too, under general notes. I was building a record, not because I was certain yet, but because I wanted a record of the building of certainty, in the correct order, in case I needed to show someone later. The 8th day, April 10th. Greer drove to Mountainburg for supplies that morning, which was a day earlier than scheduled, because I had sent a note with him to wire Forsyth from the telegraph office there. The note asked Forsyth for 2 things: a 2-week extension on the contract timeline, and the contractual language that would apply if we were forced to abandon for reasons constituting what the contract called extraordinary field conditions. I worded it carefully. I did not mention what was happening in the hollow. I had no language for it that Forsyth would have taken seriously, and using the wrong language would have made everything harder. While Greer was gone, Ray and I worked the east slope, and Calvin moved the rod, and the day went quietly in the professional sense. The transit ran true, the numbers were good, the sky was clear, and the light held until nearly 6. One of the better surveying days of my career, technically speaking. I remember this clearly because of the contrast it made with what the night brought. Greer came back at dusk with the supplies, and a telegram from Forsyth, which I read by lantern light after supper. Forsyth refused both requests. The timeline extension was not possible because the railroad's engineering schedule was firm, and the extraordinary conditions language in the contract applied only to natural disasters, meaning flooding or fire, and not to unspecified field difficulties. He told me to complete the work as contracted. He also told me the railroad had already begun procurement discussions based on our preliminary data, which meant the financial stakes were larger than the penalty clause alone. If we abandoned, the damage would extend beyond what the clause covered. Forsyth did not say this as a threat. He said it as a fact. I put the telegram on the cook table and looked at it for a while. Then I told the crew what it said. Ray asked me what I intended to do. Greer said he had already told me what he thought. Finish the work and stop letting a noise drive business decisions. Calvin said nothing. I looked at each of them and said I needed to think it through overnight, and that I would tell them in the morning. Greer said fair enough, and went to bed. Ray sat by the lantern for another hour, reading his Bible, which he did most evenings, and went to bed. Calvin sat at the cook table after everyone else had turned in, and I sat across from him, and we did not talk much, but we both stayed up later than we should have, neither of us saying why. It was Calvin who finally said what both of us were thinking. He said he thought Forsyth's telegram did not matter, that the real question was not what the contract said, but what was in the dark on the other side of that tree line, and that he thought we should not be in this hollow past the following night. He said he thought the thing out there, whatever it was moving toward a point, and that it was not going to be content to just knock and leave when it reached that point. I asked him what made him think that. He said because of the rod. He said because of what it chose to do with our things versus what it had not done to us yet, and that the space between those two things was shrinking, and he thought deliberately. I asked him if he was frightened. He looked at me and said he would rather be somewhere else. He said it the way a person says a thing that costs them something to admit. I will tell you that I nearly gave the order that night. I nearly told him to wake the others and begin breaking camp by lantern light and be out of that hollow by dawn. If I had made that decision at the cook table on the night of April 10th, Calvin Marsh would be 50 years old today, instead of a name in a missing persons report that was filed and closed inside of a month and is now in a county records office that nobody visits. I did not make that decision. I told him to get some sleep, that I would have an answer in the morning. That is a thing I live with. I am not asking for understanding about it. I am telling you it happened, because the record should be accurate. The 9th day, April 11th. This is the day I promised to return to, and I am returning to it now. We should have been breaking camp. Instead, we worked. We were 2/3 of the way through the East Slope Traverse, and by my reckoning, 2 full days of clean work would finish it. I made the calculation that I had been making every day since Cates's porch, the cost of staying against the cost of going, measured in dollars and professional reputation, against a threat I could describe but not name, made by something I had heard and partially inferred but never seen. I made the wrong calculation one final time and told the crew we were working. Greer was satisfied. Ray said nothing. Calvin ate his breakfast and picked up the rod. We worked hard that day. By noon, we had pushed the traverse past a point where I could see, if the afternoon stayed good, that we might compress the remaining work into 1 additional day, rather than 2. I drove the pace. I drove it hard, and the crew matched me, which is what a good crew does. By 3 in the afternoon, we had the critical data in hand. By 4, we had corroborated it with a redundant check shot. By 5, I knew that 1 more morning of work would close the traverse, give me the complete profile data the railroad needed, and allow us to break camp and leave. 1 more morning. I should have left that night. I should have told them we had enough, that the data we had was sufficient, that we were going. I can give you the professional reasons I did not. An incomplete traverse has gaps in the data that create interpretation problems, and gaps in survey data can be costly in ways that are not immediately obvious, but that engineers discover during design. A surveyor's reputation rests on completeness. I told myself all of these things, and I stayed for 1 more night. The 9th night, April 11th into April 12th. The knocking started at 10:47 by my watch. I know the time exactly because I was awake when it started, sitting up in my bedroll, and I had checked my watch 10 minutes before with the particular nervous precision of a man who cannot sleep and is trying to impose order on the waiting. It came from the southwest, as it always did now, and it was close, very close. Ray's voice came from across the tent, low and controlled, and he said, 20 yards, not a question, an estimate. I thought he was right, perhaps 25. The creek was 40 feet below the bench, the tree line was 15 feet from the edge of our platform, and the sound was coming from inside the timber, not from its edge but from perhaps 20 yards into it. The hollow quality of it was different this close, less mediated by distance, and I could hear something in it I had not been able to hear before, a texture. The sound was not uniform. There was a variation in it from strike to strike, a slight difference in the resonance of the 3rd beat compared to the 1st and 2nd, as if the thing making it was using its hands rather than a tool, and the angle of the 3rd strike was slightly different from the others. This is a very small distinction, but I had been listening to this sound for 9 nights, and I heard it. 3 beats, silence. 3 beats, silence. I was on my feet. Ray was on his feet. Outside, I heard Greer's tent open, which was the first time Greer had gotten up in the night on this job, and that fact was more alarming to me in some ways than the proximity of the sound. Thomas Greer did not get up in the night without a reason. Greer came to our tent and said in a low voice that it was inside the tree line and that we needed to talk. I came out and the three of us stood in the dark outside the tent in the cold April air, which was in the mid-30s that night, and we listened. The sound had stopped when the tent opened, and the silence was the wrong kind, the thick, occupied silence that Ray had described as assessment. Something was listening to us. I looked at the fourth tent, Calvin's, and its opening was tied shut from inside. We stood for perhaps 2 minutes without speaking. Then Greer said, very quietly, "We need to go." This was Thomas Greer, the man who, 4 days earlier, had said he was not going to be run off a survey by something that would not show itself. He said we needed to go, and his voice had no heat in it, just the flat quality of a man who has updated his assessment and is stating the new result. I asked about the equipment. He said we leave it. I asked about the field books. He said we take what we can carry and we go, and that he would start breaking down his tent. Ray was already moving toward the supply crates. I went to Calvin's tent and said his name, then said it louder. The tent opening stayed tied. I said his name again and told him we were leaving, that we needed him to come now, and that we were going up the track to the vehicles and driving out tonight. There was a long pause, and then Calvin's voice came through the canvas, calm and quiet, and he said, "I can't come out." I asked him why. He said he thought it was right outside the tent and that he was not going to open the flap. I told him it was 20 yards into the timber. He said he thought it was closer than that now. And then it knocked. 3 beats, directly from the southwest, and the proximity of it was something I felt as much as heard, a physical pressure in the air, and I cannot tell you with any certainty how close it was, because my judgment of distance at that moment was compromised by something that was very close to fear. But it was not 20 yards. It was inside 20 yards, and it was at the edge of the bench, not in the timber. It was at the edge of the bench, and we were standing in the open. I said Calvin's name again, loudly now, and I said we had to go immediately, and he had to come now. His voice came back very steady and said, "I am not opening this tent." I pulled at the canvas flap from outside, but it was tied from within, and he had either knotted it or was holding it. The canvas did not give. Ray was behind me, saying we had to leave, we had to go now, and Greer was already at the track. I said Calvin's name one final time. The tent was still. We ran. I want to be precise about the pursuit, because it is where most accounts of something like this collapse into vagueness, and I do not want this account to do that. We went up the track at a dead run, the 3 of us, carrying what we had grabbed in the 2 minutes of breakdown, which was the transit case, Ray's field book, and my own kit bag with the bent rod in it. The track ran 1.25 miles to the trailhead and the vehicles, and it climbed roughly 300 feet in elevation over that distance, on a winding path through timber that was black and close on both sides. We had one lantern between us, Greer's, which he carried at the front. We heard nothing for the first 1/4 mile. I began to think, in the way you think when you are running and your blood is loud in your ears, that we had perhaps broken the proximity and that the sound had been its final challenge, and it had stopped at the edge of the bench. I began to hear the click of Greer's boots on the track stones and the sound of our breathing, and to think we were going to make it up to the vehicles in silence. Then the knocking came from the east side of the track. Not from behind, from the side. Ahead of us and to the right, from the uphill timber, roughly parallel to where we were, and it was not slow, it was keeping pace. 3 beats, and then we ran another 50 yards and it came again from the same relative position, still to the east, still ahead of us, still at pace with us. It was not running, it was not behind us and gaining, it was walking. And it was to the side, and it knew where the track went. Ray said afterward that this was the most frightening part. Not the sound near the tent, not the proximity of the bench, but the fact that it was flanking us on the uphill side of a track it knew, in darkness that was nothing to it, and everything to us. That it was moving at the pace we were moving and staying level with us, which meant it was holding back. It could have been ahead of us, It was choosing not to be. Greer ran. I ran. Ray ran. We ran the rest of that 1.25 miles without stopping and without slowing, the lantern throwing wild shadows into the timber on both sides. And the knocking came 4 more times in the course of that run, always from the east side, always ahead and level, always 3 beats, always that same hollow resonant quality, unchanged by the pace of travel and the rough terrain, as steady as a man walking a road he has walked 1,000 times. At the trailhead, the timber opened up onto the lower ridge and the Cates farm field, and we came out of the tree line at a run and did not stop running until we reached the vehicles. The knocking did not follow us out of the timber. It stopped at the tree line, the last series coming just as the timber thinned, 3 final beats from just inside the shadow of the canopy, and then nothing. We got into the vehicles. Greer started the truck. Ray got into the Dodge with me, and I turned the key and pulled out of the farm lot without going to the farmhouse. I did not stop to tell Dillard Cates what had happened. I drove north on the road toward Mountainburg, with Ray in the passenger seat and my hands on the wheel, and did not stop for 40 minutes. When I stopped, it was at a wide spot on the highway, where the timber gave way to a long field, and I could see the road ahead and behind, for a 1/4 mile in each direction, in the early dawn light, which was just coming on, grey and quiet. I stopped and turned off the engine, and Ray and I sat for a moment without speaking. Then Ray said Calvin's name, quietly, and I said yes, and we sat for another minute. Greer pulled the truck in behind us. He got out and came to the window and said we needed to keep driving. I said I knew. I asked if he thought we should go back. He looked at the road behind us, back toward the south where the hollow was, and then he looked at me and said, "Not today. Just that. Not a refusal. Not a denial. Not today." I drove to Mountainburg and sent a wire to Forsyth that said the survey had been abandoned due to extraordinary field conditions and that I would provide a full report in writing. Then I drove north to Springfield and wrote the report. The report I gave to Forsyth was accurate in every professionally measurable fact and silent on every fact that was not professionally measurable. It described the survey data collected, the percentage of the traverse completed, the physical condition of the equipment left behind, and the reason for abandonment in the following terms. Crew safety concern due to evidence of large unidentified wildlife activity in the camp perimeter. That was the report I gave Forsyth. It was not a lie, it was a professional document, which means it was shaped by what a professional document can contain. Forsyth applied the penalty clause. The firm disputed it and lost. The railroad eventually surveyed a different corridor, farther north, and the hollow remained unsurveyed, and, as far as I know, remains so today. A search was organized for Calvin Marsh. I participated in it. 6 men, myself included, went back into the hollow on May 4th, 1923, 3 weeks after we came out. We found the camp as we had left it, the transit on its tripod, the field books on the cook table, the tents standing. Calvin's tent was empty. His bedroll was inside it, and it was undisturbed in a way that I found harder to interpret than if it had been disturbed. The lantern on his kit box had burned out. His boots were inside the tent. His coat was on the peg above the tent opening. His boots and his coat were inside. We searched the hollow for 3 days. We found no body, no sign of a struggle at the camp, no physical evidence of what had happened in the night. The one thing we found, which I noted in the search log, and which the county deputy who accompanied us also noted, was a set of marks in the clay at the southwest edge of the bench, outside Calvin's tent. Not footprints. Not any impression I could match to a human foot or a known animal track. They were impressions, 3 of them, arranged in a line parallel to the tent wall, each one roughly elliptical, each one approximately 1.5 feet at its longest measurement, spaced about 4 feet apart from center to center. They were deep. Whatever made them had weight behind them. I photographed them. The photographs came out blurred because my hands were not steady when I took them, and I have not shown them to anyone because I cannot prove they are not tree root impressions or some natural feature of the clay. I know what they are, but I cannot prove it. The search was concluded without a finding. Calvin Marsh was officially listed as missing and presumed lost. The county was satisfied with this determination. I was not, but I had nothing to offer them that they would have put in an official document. I drove back to Springfield. I went back to work. I surveyed 2 more jobs that summer, a road layout in Phelps County and a property division in Douglas County, and I did my work correctly and billed my clients and went home in the evenings. I did not talk about the hollow to anyone except my wife, who listened to the full account once and then told me she believed me and asked me never to go back, and I told her I would not. She asked me what I thought it was. I told her I did not know, and that is still true in the sense that I cannot give her a name from a book. But I can tell you what I believe it to be in terms of its nature, which is different from its name. I believe it is old. I believe it has been in that hollow for longer than the Osage were in those hills, and I believe Dillard Cates's summary of the old knowledge about those hollows was accurate, that it will tolerate passage but not habitation. I believe it understood the difference between a hunting party moving through and a crew with an instrument setting up permanent stations, and that the survey represented, to its understanding of territory, an act of claim. And I believe it responded to that act of claim the way a property owner responds to a trespass that has not yet become a permanent one, with escalating notice, then with a demonstration of capability, then with enforcement. The word the 3 of us used, independently, to describe the pursuit across that 1.25 miles of dark track, was methodical. Not frenzied, not fast, methodical. As if it was herding rather than hunting. As if it wanted us to reach the road and not stop before we did, and was ensuring we did not make that mistake. I have thought about that many times. I think Calvin Marsh did not come out of his tent because he understood something that the 3 of us who ran understood only in the running, that the arrangement it was offering was a departure, not a punishment. That if you went, it would let you go. And I think Calvin, for a reason I will never know, did not go. I am going to say now, directly into Mr. Carver's recording apparatus, the thing that I asked to say on record. I do not know what railroad interests or development interests currently hold options on land in that part of the Boston Mountains, and I do not know what surveying or engineering work may have been commissioned or considered in the decades since 1923. But if anyone with authority over those decisions hears this account or reads a transcription of it, I am asking formally that the hollow southeast of Mountainburg be left alone, not posted, not fenced, not studied, left alone. You can call it superstition. You can call it the testimony of a man who was frightened in the dark and never fully recovered his judgment. I have been called both of those things by men with degrees and contracts, and they were not there. And I was. The thing in that hollow has a sense of property. It demonstrated that sense to us over 9 nights with patience and precision, and it collected what it was owed when we did not listen. A 23-year-old man's life was part of that collection. I was responsible for keeping him there one night past the point where I knew we should have left, and I am the one who left without him, and I carry both of those facts every day, and will carry them until I do not carry anything anymore. The bent survey rod is in my office. It is behind the filing cabinet, wrapped in burlap, and I have not shown it to anyone in 9 years. It is not a curiosity. It is a record. I keep it because a surveyor keeps evidence, and because throwing it away would feel like a kind of lie, as if I had decided to pretend the evidence did not exist because the evidence is inconvenient. I am not able to do that. Inconvenient evidence is still evidence. If you go into that hollow, go through it. Do not camp, do not set instruments, do not plant stakes and come back to them. Do not stake a claim on ground that is already claimed by something that was there before the Osage and will be there long after the last surveyor in the state of Arkansas has put down his transit. Do not stay. I was a skeptic once. I measured the world in tenths of feet, and I believed that what could be measured could be understood, and what could be understood could be managed. I believed this professionally, with the conviction of a man who has built a career on applied rationalism. I do not believe it anymore. Not about everything, not about that hollow. Some places in the world are occupied by something that does not appear in any survey, and the correct professional response to that discovery is not to find a framework that contains it. The correct response is to leave. That is all I have to say. I am grateful to Mr. Carver for the opportunity to say it on record, and I ask that the transcription be kept complete and that the date and my full name be affixed to it. Gerald Purvis Alcott, Surveyor, Springfield, Missouri, October 14th, 1932. You have been told.